Hey guys, Matt from the Rational Rant, and today's video is going to be episode 2 in our series called Global Threat Climate Change. Now, it has been a couple days since I've uploaded a video, and that is due to some stark discoveries that I've made in reference to doing this entire series. I'm not going to state anything myself. I'm going to be playing a lot of footage in this video, probably about an hour or two's worth. And it is really going to highlight some issues that I didn't even know about and that I was honestly wrong on. We need to share this information. We need to get it out. And we need to make sure that people know what's going to be happening in the future. So without further ado, let's get right into it.
We are heading for mass extinction. There you go. That's it. End it there. As humans destroy our own habitat. That is the no-holds-barred message from climate change expert Guy McPherson from the University of Arizona. Some label him an eco-terrorist. Others say he's an anarchist. But could he just be a realist? Guy's in New Zealand on a speaking tour and joins me now. Guy, great to see you again.
Likewise, Paul.
Last time I spoke to you, 2014, and you sort of, snatched any hope of a future from me and my family. It was doom and gloom. Has anything changed since then in your account of things?
Oh yes, the situation is far worse than it was then.
Okay. So essentially, to paraphrase, we're just all wasting our time even talking about climate change and global warming and sea rising.
Well, I'd appreciate the opportunity for people to know what's going on in the world. That's why I do what I do. And so I don't think we need to not talk about it. I think we need to let people know that what is underway is
But it's futile.
Well, action is futile except with respect to our personal selves and how we feel about ourselves. Yes, action is the antidote to despair, said Edward Abbey, the desert anarchist.
Are you an anarchist?
I am, and I know what that means. It's not chaos. Anarchism is not a romantic notion, but an idea, a way of living that has been proven successful for 3 million years of the human experience.
If you're right, then you are also surely wrong. I mean, you say that it's important that we talk about it so that we know what's going on, but I don't think that's why we talk about it. If you're right, the reason we talk about it is in an attempt essentially to fool ourselves into thinking that we can actually stave it off.
Well, it depends on your perspective. Again, my perspective is that there is nothing to be done in terms of preserving the human species more than a few more years. Other people think that actions will increase their own longevity, which might be true depending upon what they do and where they move to. But I think in terms of the human race, we're done. It's locked in. It's been locked in for a long time. We're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction.
Okay, we'll talk about your time frame in a moment, because I guess that you've already indicated that's something that does change because things have got worse rapidly, more rapidly than perhaps you originally thought. You almost imply in some of your writing that we have the arrogance to believe that the future of the planet and the future of humankind is the same thing. In reality, you hold quite a positive outlook for the future of the planet, just not with us on it.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we've had humans on the planet, our species, for about 200,000 years. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. We're
just a moment. We're a moment in time.
We really are. I mean, it's a geological blink, and it looks like we're beyond geological at this point, and into the real blink.
With humans gone, and presumably not only humans, but other life as we know it, will the planet actually heal itself, given enough millennia?
It will take millions of years, as it has following previous mass extinction events. But I've no doubt there will be a thriving planet again. It's just for a few million years there will be very small things like microbes and bacteria and fungi.
As I look at you now, and I mean, what you say seems logical, much more logical than those who say we can stand in the way of this, we can shout at the tide not to come in. But I really don't believe it, because part of me, of course, being a human being, being an illogical creature, thinks I can't imagine that none of this will exist, and so I will pretend that it doesn't exist. Is that what you fight when you go around, when you lecture people around the world?
Of course, and mostly it's people who look a lot like you and me, people who are pretty privileged and can't imagine this amount of privilege going away. And so that's the difficulty. This is all we've ever known. We were born into this. I call it born into captivity. And we didn't have any choice about the matter, right? We didn't vote on whether we got to show up at this point in history. So it's difficult to imagine anything different than this, much less the kind of situation that is certain to arise in the not too distant future.
Right. It's the other thing that it's hard to imagine, even though we have absolute proof of it all around us, is that we are but a moment in time, because we know history. We know that we will not last forever.
Right.
So we potentially know some of the future. How much time do we have? How much time does the human race have?
I can't imagine there will be a human on the planet in 10 years. I suspect it'll be...
No, I'm sorry. Did you say 10 years?
Yes, in my out loud voice even. Yes, I can't... we're headed for a temperature within that span that is at or near the highest temperature experienced on Earth in the last 2 billion years. That's at least an order of magnitude faster than occurred during the Great Dying 252 million years.
But you are suggesting then that the temperature increase will be phenomenal over the next few years.
Oh, yes. Yeah, this is exponential change, and we have difficulty coming to grips with exponential change because...
No, I understand the term exponential, and I understand the term change. What I don't want to understand is your time frame. Sure. I mean, why are you even wasting time here in the studio? Why the hell are we all here? If it's only 10 years, what the hell are you doing here? You're dragging your wife around the bloody world talking about this. You've only got 10 years. Shouldn't you be at home with your kids?
I don't have kids because I could see this sort of thing coming a long time ago.
Stab me in the heart now. Seriously, 10 years?
No, we don't have 10 years. And the problem is when I give a number like that, people think it's going to be business as usual until 9 years, 300.
Your wife is in the corner of the studio taking a photo. What the hell are you taking photographs for? You're never going to look at those photos back.
Actually, that's not my wife. That's my partner, but it's a minor issue.
Oh, look, in the great scheme of things, that is just of no interest at all. Okay, so
I encourage people to pursue excellence, to pursue love, to pursue what they love to do. I don't think these are crazy ideas, actually. And I also encourage people to remain calm because nothing is under control, certainly not under our control.
You wouldn't imagine, though, that things are going to get better. They could only get worse. So presumably in terms of your time frame... Given that, I can't remember what you said to me 2 years ago, how I let it slip my mind, I don't know, but it was certainly a much greater time frame than 10 years.
Oh, yes.
So
yes,
that's your maximum time frame. Do you worry that, up until now I was prepared to go with you, but now you've snatched all hope of a future from me and my darling children? That's my daughter over there, Bella. She hasn't had an opportunity. She hasn't had a fair crack of the whip.
I know, and I feel horrible about that. I really do. The young people on the planet have not had an opportunity to live full lives, to even come to grips with what it means to live.
Don't even finish the sentence. We haven't got time. So I just wonder, either I should stop talking to you now and never talk to you again, or I may as well continue talking to you because there's no point talking to anyone else. Do you know what I mean?
I absolutely know what you mean. Yes.
How do you then...
And you're right. There's no point in talking to anybody else, Paul. It's just me and you.
So just here's the thing, Guy. God. If people believe you, and virtually no one will, especially now you've thrown the time frame in, if they do believe you, how will you prevent a state of absolute hopelessness creeping in around the globe?
I think hope is a horrible idea. Hope is wishful thinking. Hope, let me quote Nietzsche on this one. Hope in reality is the worst of evils, for it extends the torments of man. Hope and fear are the twin sides of the, I don't know the future coin, but I think it's really good or I think it's really horrible, but I'm not going to take any action either way. Hope is a bad idea. Let's abandon that and get on with reality instead. Let's get on with living instead of wishing for the future that never comes.
I'm glad I'm not in the business of autonomous cars because I was pretty convinced they were going to change our lives for the better within the next 10 years. More fool them. Okay, well, thanks for that, Guy. I've got my executive producer in my ear saying we've got to move on. We don't have to do anything, Sarah, quite frankly, with this information. We don't have to do anything. And that whole broadcasting standards guideline book, forget that bloody thing. Okay, so Guy, just in terms of, because obviously this is what I need to know. Bella needs to know it as well. Best guess for the future of humanity is how many years?
Oh, I'm not going to go there. I encourage people to live fully. In the time we have left, to be fully present with the ones we're with, including the rest of the living planet, but I don't know your expiration date.
Okay, Guy, take care. Why? Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay.
I appreciate
By the
it.
way, just quickly, I can't, because this has come like a bolt out of the blue from me. I should have known this. It should have been on the card 10 years.
No.
What do you make of all
have
the
10
other
years.
experts? Because you're an expert. What do you make of all the other experts that do seem to think we can affect change, we can survive. They are experts as well, or claim to be.
Right. And well, for one thing, they're paid, and so they only go halfway in presenting the information. Almost nobody is willing to add up the feedbacks that we have triggered and the consequences of them. So because we're a society that is focused on specialization, the specialists are geared towards understanding one aspect or another aspect of climate change. Things like global dimming or the melting of the Arctic ice and the albedo associated with that, or the methane. Nobody's putting all those things together. So
in a nutshell, they're lying, essentially. They're fooling themselves and everybody else.
I would hate to use the word lying. I think it's far worse than that.
Guy, thank you very much for joining us. That is Guy McPherson, Emeritus Professor of Natural Resources and Evolutionary Biology from the University of Arizona.
Every year of my life, that's almost 52 years so far, the world has become a worse and worse place. Every year we have polluted more water than the year before. Every year there's been less clean air than there was the year before that. Every year there are fewer species on the planet than the year before that. We're driving 200 species a day to extinction. Every year there's fewer salmon. Every year there's fewer carnivores. We're about to see that turn around. The living planet is about to make a comeback. And that's really, really good news. And I want to talk about that today within the context of discussing these other matters. So this is the outline for my talk. I'm going to talk about the myth of sustainability. Sustainability is a myth. So in that light, I'm going to talk about the importance of durability, and then talk about the twin sides of the fossil fuel coin, which is mostly what I speak and write about: global climate change and energy decline, or peak oil. And then describe a little bit about some templates for durable living arrangements in the future. Sustainability is a myth, as indicated by the second law of thermodynamics. Things break down. Entropy. It's a law. It's not a strong suggestion. It's the second law of thermodynamics. As an example, we emerge from the void, we take a few blinks, we go back into the void, and that's at the level of every organism. Think about the human lifespan. At the level of every culture, including industrial culture in which we are enmeshed, and every species. Homo sapiens, if we stop today, if our extinction comes tonight, say, then we will have lasted about 1/7 as long as the typical species of mammal. A couple 100,000 years. That's not long at all when you consider the run of the universe, for example, just this one little universe from amongst the multiverse. And I already mentioned the second law of thermodynamics in particular, although the laws of thermodynamics generally preclude sustainability. And if you need one more reason why sustainability is a myth, understand this. Who has the world's largest sustainability program? That would be Walmart. If that doesn't convince you that sustainability is a myth, I don't think there's anything I can say that would. Cheap plastic crap at Walmart is not about sustainability. Neoclassical economics assumes that we will always find substitutes, that we can continue infinite growth on a finite planet. As a consequence, obsolescence is built in. And particularly since World War II in this country, we make everything so that it's a throwaway object. Think about cars. Since World War II, every car gets a remake every year, so that everybody can tell, you're not driving the 2012 Prius, you're driving the 2011 Prius, it's got those funny chrome wheels. You really should have the 2012. That's what designed obsolescence is all about. Make us feel like we need to consume more stuff. Biophysical economics has been proposed within the last 15 years or so. The leading champion is a guy named Charles Hall at State University of New York. The only person I know denied tenure at an Ivy League institution the same week he made the cover of Science for his work on energy. Doing excellent work in the realm of biophysical economics, which recognizes that we live on a finite planet, therefore there are limits to growth, and therefore that conservation might be a good idea. instead of built-in obsolescence. Even the New York Times in late 2008 had an article that concluded neoclassical economics is dead and the only way forward is biophysical economics. Of course, in every issue of the New York Times before and after that, they abandoned that notion, but there was a glimmer of hope there for one day on page E27 in the 4th column. It was very exciting for me when it happened. I want to talk about climate change, and I'm going to call it climate chaos because it's well underway. This is not gradual change. This is climate chaos. In late 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the noted IPCC, using a consensus process, which is very conservative, concluded that we're headed for a 1 degree C temperature increase by 2100. We had at that point experienced a 0.8 degree temperature increase. So if it doesn't seem at all outrageous that we would enjoy another 0.2 degree temperature increase in the next 100 years, I can imagine how you might think that's a fairly conservative assessment. Merely for elucidating the obvious, the IPCC was awarded a share of the Nobel Peace Prize. A year later, the Hadley Center for Meteorological Research in England concluded that we're headed for a 2 degree C temperature increase by 2100. Now, 2 degrees C doesn't sound like much. It doesn't sound like any big deal at all. But in fact, 2 degrees C is absolutely huge. 2 degrees C kicks into play several positive feedback loops that almost certainly lead to 6 degrees C and in the short term thereafter a runaway greenhouse. 2 degrees C, by every assessment I've read, indicates a near-term transition to human extinction. The Hadley Center for Meteorological Research was established by that wacky liberal Margaret Thatcher. So this is not exactly a left-wing liberal organization. This is a very conservative assessment. And it indicates we're headed for our extinction in the not-too-distant future. United Nations Environment Program, 6 months later, concludes we're headed for 3.5 degrees C by 2100. Each of these models and assessments relies on an increasing amount of data, increasingly sophisticated models, and supercomputers that run ever faster. So you can imagine the computers we had in 2007 were basically the equivalent of the abacus for those of you who are 20 years old. You know, that's forever ago. That's like a telephone where you actually have to stand there and dial the phone. And you dial, you're making sparks. Right? I mean, that's how old that technology is relative to today's standards. So we have much better information at this point. The United Nations Environment Program says we're headed for 3.5 degrees C by 2100. The Hadley Center comes along not long after the previous assessment and says 4 is the new 2, and it's coming by mid-century. This is huge. This is unimaginably huge. It was ignored, of course, by all the major media outlets. 4 degrees C almost certainly is the final nail in the coffin for the human experience. It's coming as early as mid-century. The really bad news, I have half the screen left. Consistent with 4 degrees C temperature increase by mid-century, the Copenhagen Project and the Global Carbon Project, and rather the Copenhagen Diagnosis, concluded that we're headed for 6 or 7 degrees C by the end of the century. And that's what happens when you set positive feedbacks into motion. Now, interestingly, none of these assessments include those positive feedbacks. None of these include positive feedbacks, including the International Energy Agency's report from just over a year ago of 3.5 degrees C by 2035. Or how do you like the United Nations Environment Program just over a year ago, 6.4 degrees C by mid-century. 6.4 degrees C. The last time it was 6 degrees C warmer than baseline on this planet, there were snakes the size of yellow school buses living in the Amazon, and the largest mammal was the size of a shrew, because that's the largest mammal that can thermoregulate at those kind of temperatures. I gave a talk in Petoskey a couple of days ago, and it was preceded by a showing of the film, National Geographic film, 6 Degrees Could Change the World. The film was released in 2006, and they went through every 1 degree C temperature change up to 6 degrees C. And at 6 degrees C, it's a truly, truly dire outcome for human beings and every other organism on the planet. There is little question that if 6.4 degrees C doesn't cause our extinction by 2050, that it won't come long after that. The really bad news is that none of these models, none of these assessments take into account positive feedbacks. National Center for Atmospheric Research, just over a year ago, put out the only comprehensive assessment to include positive feedbacks, and they indicate we're headed for 16 degrees C world by 2100. That's hot. I have good news though. The bad news is that none of these assessments take into account positive feedbacks. The good news is that none of them take into account collapse of the industrial economy. So there may be a way to allow our species to persist a few more generations. Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, one of the premier journals in all of the sciences, concludes that climate change is irreversible over temporal spans relative to human beings. That is, the CO2 that's in the atmosphere today is there for at least the next 1,000 years. The planet cannot sequester carbon from the atmosphere nearly as fast as we're putting it up there. So we're at 394 parts per million for at least the next 1,000 years. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, we had 250 parts per million. We're almost at 400 already. That's unbelievably rapid change. United Nations Environment Program points out that during 2008, global carbon emissions actually increased. This was a stunning surprise because some of you remember 2008 as the year of the Great Recession. The year we stopped calling them, the year we called it the Great Recession because we never call anything a depression anymore because that's too depressing. So it's just a recession. During the Great Recession, the industrial economy of the planet was not slowed enough to reduce carbon emissions. They set a record. The record, of course, has been shattered 3 times since then. And last year, 2011, we set an all-time record by increasing carbon emissions 6.5% over the year before, which is a 6% increase over the year before that. We're in exponential increase land when it comes to carbon emissions. A paper rejected by several journals before it was accepted and published in the very prestigious journal Climatic Change, published in November 2009, says only economic collapse will prevent runaway climate change. It's published by Tim Garrett at the University of Utah in the November 2009 issue of the prestigious journal Climatic Change. And it might be too late. According to a paper in Science, from about a year ago, the Arctic is defrosting, which means that warm Atlantic water, instead of reversing course at Greenland, is shooting through the Fram Strait off the north and eastern Greenland coast straight into the Arctic, producing the warmest years on record in the Arctic in the last 2 years, and the years with the lowest snow mass and ice mass observed in the Arctic in recorded history. That's one of 5 positive feedbacks that we've kicked into play. It's a positive feedback because the more warm water that goes up there, the more the ice melts. The more the ice melts, the more open water is exposed. The albedo is reduced, so there's less reflectance off the ice back into space. So the water is warming, and as that water warms, the ice melts, and the water warms and the ice melts. So that's one positive feedback. There are 4 more. Peat in the world's boreal forests is combusting, and that's a huge carbon source that used to be a carbon sink. As it gets drier, more of that carbon is combusted and sent up to the atmosphere, which makes it drier and hotter, which makes more of that peat combust and go up to the atmosphere. Another positive feedback. 2 years ago, in the summertime, summer of 2010, a bunch of researchers went out into Siberia and showed off. You can see a bunch of this stuff on YouTube. They showed off by lighting Siberia on fire. There was these big methane vents that they could light on fire. It looked really cool. You strike a match and this thing goes. It was great sport for scientists on YouTube. That was 2010. 2011, nobody was lighting anything on fire in Siberia because those vents were several kilometers across. You don't want to light that on fire. You're going to lose your mustache. Just in a year, we went from isolated vents to kilometers across, these methane vents. Methane is 25 to 27 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. Every molecule of methane is huge when it comes to climate change. Fourth, positive feedback. We are also releasing methane hydrates or methane clathrates from the deep sea as that ice is exposed. And fourth, we have a drought in the Amazon, 2010, that produced more carbon than the United States. The Amazon is supposed to be a carbon sink. In the summer of 2010, it became a carbon source when drought was causing decomposition to occur so rapidly that the carbon loss was greater than all the cars and trucks and coal-fired power plants in this country combined. This is huge. Only economic collapse will prevent runaway greenhouse at this point. It might be too late, but I don't want us to act as if it's too late, because then it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. Then we assure extinction of our species by 2050. And I don't think that's a good idea. With respect to economic scenarios, I want to point out how quickly a large legitimate organization like this large French bank forecast that the industrial economy can reach its end. In mid-2009, after the Great Recession was over, Societe Generale warned its clients as one of 3 equally weighted forecasts that they should prepare for collapse of the world's industrial economy within 2 years. Obviously that didn't happen. We're past mid-November 2011, so that didn't happen. The World Bank predicted in mid-January 2012 that the coming downturn will be worse than that of 2008. Now, in 2008, in September in fact, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, Ben Bernanke, concluded that we came within a hair's breadth of losing Western civilization. We were so close to the brink. Nearly every bank failed in the United States except one. He admitted this years after the events of September 2008 brought down AIG and Lehman Brothers. But he did admit later that the events of that period nearly terminated Western civilization. We're headed for a downturn, according to the World Bank, worse than 2008 in the relatively near term. These 75 individuals predict that global economic collapse will be complete by the end of this year. And none of these people are using the Mayan calendar to come up with that assessment. The latest person to join the party is George Soros, multi-billionaire, who I can assure you does not want economic collapse to occur. If economic collapse occurs, what that means is money is worthless. On July 5th, 2010, Niall Ferguson, the Harvard professor of history, social critic, and sometime economist and philosopher, predicted that economic collapse would be complete within 2 years, which suggests July 5th of this year. But last week, he said there's a way out. This is a Harvard professor of history, Niall Ferguson. He says the way out is to bomb and occupy Iran for their oil. Even the lefties have joined the brigade. The only exception from amongst all these people who doesn't predict global economic collapse by the end of this year is Dmitry Orlov. That's why there's an asterisk beside his name. Orlov wrote the book Reinventing Collapse, the Soviet Example and American Prospects. And in that book, and for years before that, Orlov has been predicting 5 stages of collapse: financial, commercial, governmental, social, and cultural. And he was sticking with that up until October 30th of last year. October 30th of last year, he announced that clearly he was wrong. That because of the steps taken by central banks and governments around the world, we don't have a 5-stage collapse, we have a 2-stage collapse, and financial is done. So we have 1 stage left. It can happen any day. What's driving the potential for collapse of the industrial economy is peak oil. This slide shows the typical extraction pattern of finite materials, this bell-shaped curve. These are the data, these points. And this curve was drawn by Marion King Hubbard in 1956, based on these data points up to here, up to 1956. The presentation in 1956, Marion King Hubbard, a petroleum geologist working for Shell Oil Company, announced 3 predictions in describing how extraction of finite materials follows this curve. He said he expected the United States oil supply to peak in terms of extraction, or production as it's usually called, between 1969 and 1971. That peak came in 1970. He predicted the peak would be here at 3 billion barrels a day, and he considerably undershot, but he got the year exactly right. He forecast between 1969 and 1971. It happened in 1970. In 1956, he predicted that we would pass the world oil peak in about a half a century. We passed the world oil peak in May of 2005, so he missed that by 7 months, 50 years in advance. And the third prediction he made is that there would be significant cultural disruption in the wake of passing the world oil peak. Arab Spring, anybody? Occupy Wall Street? You want significant cultural disruption? I think it's well underway. Those are his 3 predictions from 56 years ago. After the U.S. peaked, the United States government took the 2 steps it could take politically to accommodate the fact that our industrial economy mainlines cheap oil. The first of those strategies we know now affectionately as drill, baby, drill. So after the U.S. peaked right here, we drilled for oil where we found it, in that case Alaska. We opened up the North Slope. And we got another little shoulder of oil extraction in the wake of opening of the North Slope. But you can see that U.S. extraction or production is now down to less than half it was at peak. So that was the first political solution, was to drill where we have it, drill baby drill. The second solution is to get oil wherever we can. In the late 1970s, the last decent man in the Oval Office, in my opinion, Jimmy Carter, recognizing what it takes to maintain an empire in decline, established what has become known as the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine says that with respect to the Middle East or anywhere else in the world, that's our oil over there. In addition to drill, baby, drill, we have kill, baby, kill. Those are the 2 political strategies. 2008, we were importing 70% of our oil from foreign sources. Now it's down to about 50% because of the ongoing economic issues in this country. We aren't using nearly as much oil as we used to be using, because nobody can afford to drive anymore. And we're extracting the heck out of the tar sands. And according to a treaty we have with Canada, we get their oil before they do. That's our kind of treaty. That's the only kind of treaty we don't not pay attention to. It's the one that works seriously in our favor. So we're getting a huge amount of our oil from the tar sands, so we have to import less than we used to, which means we have to go to places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, South Somalia, and so on, to a lesser extent than would otherwise be necessary. Not that I'm a fan of the tar sands. Here's an example of what happens to countries or regions that peak late in the game, because we have technology that can keep pushing oil out beyond the limits that we used to be able to, through pumping salt water into the wells and so forth. Places like Mexico, which peaked late, go into catastrophic free fall rather than following the bell-shaped curve. They really collapse. So our number 2 supplier is in absolute free fall. It won't be long before Mexico is unable to export any oil, no matter how badly we need it, because they need it for their own uses. Oil extraction follows the same pattern as oil discovery, and oil discoveries have been falling since 1964. You can't drill it if it ain't there. And every time somebody discovers a huge find of oil somewhere on the planet, it makes the news. And by huge find, they mean something that ends with an illion barrels. We have illions and illions of barrels out there. But do the math. If somebody reports a 3 billion barrel find, that's said to be a big, big number. 3 billion barrel find, we use 75 million barrels a day. 3 billion barrels isn't going to last long at 75 million barrels a day. World oil production peaked, or extraction peaked in 2005, assuming a 4% annual decline rate, which is a very conservative projection. We have access to the same amount of oil at the world level in 2025 as we did in 1970, when there were less than half this number of people on the planet, and the planet was far less industrialized. 12 cars in all of China and India, for example. Not very many people on the planet relative to today, and not much desire for increasing industrialization beyond Europe, Japan, and the United States. It's difficult for me to imagine we make it to 2025 with the lights on. This is a general pattern of what was predicted to happen and now what has happened in the wake of passing the world oil peak. And the blue line is the quantity of extraction, and you can see that we've been on an undulating plateau with very little increased oil availability since 2000. In fact, according to BP data, we hit that undulating plateau in 1998. Small wonder then that by every macroeconomic measure, the US economy peaked in 2000, including the major stock indices, which peaked in 1999 or 2000. So we've been in economic decline for a while now. The last superpower didn't take this long to fall. Once we hit that undulating plateau of oil extraction, the price, when demand goes up, the price goes up. And so in July of 2008, we saw the price of oil spike to $147.27 in the wake of the peak. And then, unexpectedly to most people, except petroleum geologists and economists who had been paying attention to what happens with oil, the price plummeted down to $34.20. Within 6 months, the price went from $147 to $34. That's what happens in the wake of peak. You get these huge fluctuations in price. That destroys all incentive and therefore potential for developing alternatives to oil. When the price of oil got down below $100, T. Boone Pickens canceled his plans for wind farms all over the Great Plains. Matt Simmons canceled his plans for big wave energy to save the state of Maine. It just doesn't pay at those low prices. Price spiked again later to $126 and has been hovering down around the $110 mark. Since then, that price spike was in April. It hardly even matters that we have nearly 1 trillion barrels of oil left in the ground. That's largely irrelevant. What matters in terms of the industrial economy, in terms of economic recessions and ultimately economic collapse, is the price of oil. Every worldwide economic recession since 1972 has been preceded by a spike in the price of oil. The bigger the spike, the more dire the recession. That's why it could be that this spike to $126 last April could be the nail in the coffin with a delay. There's always a delay after the price spike until the recession begins. And if you look at that $126 oil in April last year and compare it to $147 oil in July of 2008, price that in euros, it's the same price. It's 82 euros. Small wonder the entire Eurozone is aflame at this point from an economic perspective. Small wonder that Athens, Greece, the birthplace of Western civilization, is leading the way out for industrial civilization. The Pentagon announced, echoing the U.S. Energy Information Administration in their Joint Operating Environment 2010, that there would be no spare oil capacity by 2012. I suspect that's what drove the spike to $126 oil in April. And a 10 million barrel per day gap by 2015. 10 million barrels per day is a big deal. It doesn't sound like much, it's only an illion or so. But in fact, that's 15% of world consumption. 15% sounds like no big deal. I could use without 15% of the oil, right? I'll get along just fine. Okay, but the industrial economy mainlines cheap oil. Take 15% of your blood out and see how that turns out for you. I'm guessing you'll be a little sluggish for a day or two, or maybe even longer. 15% is absolutely huge. The U.S. Army announced in their Unified Quest 2011, which they put out late in 2010, that they were preparing for martial law in this country, preparing to implement martial law in what they forecast to be a series of huge cultural events triggered by an economic decline. I'm not at all surprised that the U.S. Army is preparing for martial law. I suspect they have been for a long time. But they let us know. This is a public document first released on CNBC. Ultimately, and I don't know if it's in 2012 or not, ultimately though, peak oil and the energy decline associated with peak oil leads to the Greatest Depression. What that means is massive unemployment. Officially. So just as today, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that there's an 8-point-something unemployment rate, when in fact the real number is 25%. They will be reporting considerably less than 100% unemployment. And everybody who's around will be working. That's not what I'm talking about. People will be working to produce their food and their water. They'll just be officially unemployed. As crude oil becomes less and less available, we will be distilling less and less of it into the usual distillates we think we need for transportation. What that means is no food in the grocery stores, no fossil fuels for air conditioning or heat, and no water coming from the municipal taps. What that means is no industrial civilization. And it's coming sooner than most people realize. I don't know if it's coming by the end of 2012, as 75 forecasters believe. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if it did. It wouldn't surprise me if, when Greece defaults by missing their bond payment next month, that brings down the entire industrial economy of the world. It wouldn't surprise me if it didn't either. Energy decline leads to economic collapse, and I want to point out a couple of reasons we should be joyous about that. In addition to the ones I pointed out in the beginning, the whole clean air, clean water, more salmon, more carnivore story, we can also look at the extinction rate. And as a proxy for extinction, what we have here is the number of species listed as threatened or endangered in the United States. And it tracks pretty closely with gross domestic product. The data stop in 2000, but that's okay because that's when the U.S. economy stopped growing. So GDP flatlined at that point. And under the George W. Bush administration, we stopped listing threatened and endangered species, so that flatlined at this point too, so it's still on a one-to-one line. We're driving 200 species a day to extinction. I want you to think about that for a minute. 200 species a day, every life-punishing day, we drive 200 species to extinction. At some point, one of those species is us, because we depend on those species for our very survival, for our continued persistence on this planet. Never mind the moral imperative, whether we have the right to drive 200 species a day to extinction. At some point, the issue becomes far more pragmatic than philosophical. If we are to develop a durable set of living arrangements, and it's getting awfully late in the game for that, but if we are, we must recognize that the industrial economy is a subset of the environment, not the other way around, as most economists tend to think. Before I started speaking in Michigan, I would tell people, if you think the economy is more important than the environment, try counting your money while you're holding your breath. Well, most people in Michigan took out their wallet while they're holding breath and think, yeah, I'm done, what else you got? Nobody has any money anymore. The industrial economy is a subset of the environment, not the other way around. If we don't have a healthy biosphere, it doesn't matter how much money we have. Second thing a durable set of living arrangements must accomplish is to use only local materials. Brand earth is on our way out. No imports, no exports. And we'll be forced to consume materials at the rate they are produced. Currently, we use soil and dump it into the Gulf of Mexico and use clean water and just contaminate it and foul it, and use fossil fuels at a far greater rate than they are being produced by natural processes. And fourth and finally, we must rely on our local human community for support, because there are no lone rangers in a durable set of living arrangements. What we have in this country is the antithesis of a durable set of living arrangements. We have an industrial economy built on consumption. In the wake of 9/11, what's the answer? Go to the mall. Prop up the economy, keep spending. 70% of our industrial economy is underlain by consumer spending by individuals. We must consume, consume, consume. And in fact, this set of living arrangements, suburban America, what James Howard Kunstler calls the worst misallocation of resources in the history of the world, this set of living arrangements requires us to live far from where we work, far from where we play, far from where we buy anything. So every time we want a tube of toothpaste, we have to make our third trip into town. This is absurdity defined. Consume, consume, consume. The politicians make it sound like such a good thing, but then you look at the definitions, and they don't sound that great to me. To waste or burn away, it's downright biblical. Since we don't have a durable set of living arrangements, what we require in this country to maintain an empire in decline is obedience at home, and this is in Alabama, and oppression abroad. Not to mention wholesale destruction of every aspect of the living planet. Obedience at home, that's Alabama, where several people were legally protesting illegal actions by their local banks, so the National Guard was illegally brought in to quash them. You think you have rights? Check the Patriot Act someday. Ray McGovern last year was a 71-year-old retired CIA analyst who prepared the daily intelligence briefing for 4 presidents. Ray McGovern stood up and turned his back on Hillary Clinton in a silent demonstration of his First Amendment rights when she was speaking in a public place. That's all he did. He stood up and turned his back. Now, in 2000, when George W. Bush was running for president, that happened many times. A lone student would stand up when George W. Bush was speaking, turn his back silently on the future president of the United States who was campaigning. And then several students would notice what was going on. They'd stand up too, and pretty soon a quarter or a third of the students in the room were expressing their First Amendment rights to freedom of expression by turning their back silently on the speaker. Ray McGovern, 71 years old, stood up and turned his back on Hillary Clinton when she was speaking. This is the man who prepared the daily intelligence briefing for 4 presidents. He's known in Washington, D.C., where this event took place. The security force came and beat him bloody and threw him in jail. What a difference a decade makes. We have become a totalitarian surveillance police state. Obedience at home, oppression abroad. We get what we want. And the costs don't matter. Just make sure my gas is cheap so I can get to the mall. Arundhati Roy wrote in her 2001 book, Power Politics, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet, saying nothing becomes as political an act as speaking out. There's no innocence. Either way, you're accountable. Finally, too late in an unexamined life, I realized I was accountable. So I walked away. I walked away from a life I loved, teaching at a major university, teaching poetry in prisons, teaching honors students and others. And I love that life, but you cannot point out the dark underbelly of industrial civilization and live at the apex of empire and look at yourself in the mirror every day. I put my own spin on Arundhati Roy's conclusion, pointing out that big energy poisons our water, big ag controls our seeds, big farm controls the behavior of our children, Wall Street controls the flow of money, big ag controls the messages you receive every day. The criminally rich get richer through crime. That's how America works. Through it all, we believe we're free. Yeah. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. What we have here at the apex of empire, here in the United States, the biggest and most violent, most destructive empire in the history of the world, is privilege. A huge amount of privilege. Most of that privilege results from transforming wildness into cities. If we are to thrive in the post-carbon era, if we're to thrive in any era, including the post-carbon era to come, we only need to take care of 4 things that we have some control over. We need to secure safe water, healthy food. We need to maintain our body temperature at about 37 degrees Celsius. That's 98.6 if you're doing that in Fahrenheit. And we need to create and maintain a decent human community. We can do that. This ain't exactly rocket surgery. To use the line of the last presidential campaign, yes, we can. Actually, Barack Obama, knowing what was coming, said, yes, we can. He was talking about preserving peaches and pears. Yes, we can. And it goes through like a wave. Yes, we can do this. I'm going to present a couple of templates for durable living that have been proposed by others. One of those is transition towns. This is the one forwarded primarily by Rob Hopkins. That's the cover, a picture from the cover of the book. And it shows windmills and solar panels and gardens dug up and turned in, lawns dug up and turned into gardens. And that piece of paper that's going around, that little notebook that's going around, has you signing up to learn more about the transition town movement. If economic collapse doesn't come this year, and I don't know that it will, and I don't know that it won't, it's coming. Energy decline assures it. We cannot sustain the unsustainable indefinitely. So I would encourage you to pursue something like the transition town movement, or, as I live now, in agrarian anarchy. Anarchy is not chaos, as it is so commonly confused. Anarchy is a system of governance in which individuals rely on themselves and their neighbors and take responsibility for themselves and for their neighbors. I live in agrarian anarchy at the edge of empire in a small community where I take responsibility for myself and for my neighbors, and those neighbors are humans and otherwise. If you think agrarian anarchy is wacky, think about Henry David Thoreau, or more recently, Wendell Berry, or that wacky Thomas Jefferson who built Monticello as an example of agrarian anarchy, as you see here in the picture. A third route, and I present this primarily for the youngsters in the audience because some of us are a little old to hit the road with our feet, is to travel. And history has always been kind to travelers in any sort of environment. If you show up in Marquette, say, 5-10 years from now, you will be revered as a local hero. You came all the way from Muskegon? What's it like down there? We don't have the internet anymore. We don't have television. Tell us what it's like down there. They'll feed you. They'll put you in a bed. Life will be good. I mean, look at how happy these people are traveling. These people are walking. Look how happy they are. They're all smiling. These people on horses, happy as can be. They don't need cars, airplanes, none of that crap. Look, in the ship, well, you can't see them, but they're smiling. I can see them from here. These are happy people. Sailing ships, this is great stuff. Really, this is my best stuff. It's as good as it gets. So, given ongoing and increasing climatic change, I suspect trying to mitigate in place is not a very good idea for most places. So I would encourage the youngsters in the audience in particular to be prepared for a nomadic style of life. And look how happy you can be doing that. It'll be great fun. What an adventure. It's not an apocalypse, it's an adventure. And finally, we have the post-industrial Stone Age. And at some point, with respect to electricity and water coming out of the taps and all that, we are headed for the post-industrial Stone Age. It's not the Neolithic, because we're still going to have chairs and structures, amazing structures. And we're going to have knives and forks and televisions that don't work anymore. That's really good news. I haven't watched it in 20 years, but I recall it was really bad stuff. So, at some point we're headed for a future in which there's no electricity and no water coming out of the taps. So what that means, if you are able to forage for your food by picking the stuff off of the ground and knowing what's edible, your life is actually going to be quite good. In the Neolithic, people only worked a few hours a week. A few hours a week to work to attain their food and water. And then spent the whole rest of the time doing artwork and inventing funky musical instruments and laying around and having sex and stuff. And now we spend 40 plus hours a week to do what? To get our food and water. We don't have time to lay around and do art and music, and I won't go into that at all. So those are the four templates that I present to you as alternatives for our future. And I want to finish with two things. Pointing out yet again that in my entire life, the world has gotten worse and worse and worse every year by driving more species to extinction, by fouling more water, by fouling more air, by draining more of our soil into the Gulf of Mexico, and on it goes. And we get to see the world become a better place every year in the not too distant future. When we stop pummeling the earth, pummeling the tar sands into submission so that we can drive around a little bit more, so we can have a few dollars more, we're going to see the world become a better place.
Passed out to most of you a form that asks for some feedback and also asks for you to participate in the gift economy with us. As you notice, there was no charge for you coming in. The way that Dr. McPherson works is that way with the gift economy. Please feel free to donate what feels good to you. based on, the importance of this to you and how you might want to contribute to him getting his message out to the world, which is a very unique perspective, as you will continue to hear and see. So, without much further babbling on my part, I will introduce Guy McPherson, Professor Emeritus from Arizona State. I crossed paths with his information almost 3 years ago now, and it blew me away. And ever since then, I have found myself wanting to hear more. And so here I am hearing more and helping to create more people hearing more. And so we'll let him tell you the rest of the story. Dr. Guy McPherson.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Miles, for providing the venue, which is awesome. And thanks especially to all of you for showing up. I'm going to talk about abrupt climate change. It's a completely different thing than the climate change most of us are familiar with. It's obvious at this point that abrupt climate change is underway. I hope you will find this a completely shattering experience. Enlightenment is not a happy feeling. Enlightenment is the destruction of everything you thought to be true. I was shattered in 2002 when I realized we had triggered events that moved us beyond human control and would lead to our extinction in the not very distant future. It cost me essentially all the relationships I had. It was absolutely devastating. Enlightenment is not for the faint of heart. So you need to know that this enlightenment, this version of enlightenment, of understanding where we're at and where we are almost certainly headed, is not going to make you the most popular person in the class. Unless you choose to not talk about it. Personally, I can't help myself. So occasionally I take a flight. There's somebody who sits in the window seat, poor soul. I always get the aisle seat. They raise the issue of abrupt climate change almost immediately. You're surprised how frequently it comes up. He or she says something ridiculous like abrupt climate change in the form of, hello, how's your day? Thus leaving me no choice but to have the conversation with them. For the entire history of the field of astrophysics, astrophysicists and all the rest of us believed we were right in the Goldilocks zone in terms of the distance of Earth from our sun, from the star. And then it was only about 3 years ago that it was discovered that the Earth is actually on the inner edge of the habitable zone for a sun with the characteristics of our star, of our sun. That's Venus, that is the yellow plus sign, and we know what happened to Venus with respect to its atmosphere. So this indicates we're within 1% of being pushed out of the habitable zone, within 1%. Very close to the sun, much closer to the sun than we imagine, which suggests that relatively minor changes in atmospheric chemistry will push us out of the habitable zone. Well, we haven't made minor changes in atmospheric chemistry on this planet. We've made major changes. Methane levels, a very powerful greenhouse gas, methane atmospheric levels are more than 240% above the level they were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, about 1750. Carbon dioxide levels are about 40% higher than they were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we have made major changes in atmospheric chemistry. Also from the astrophysics community, from the planetary sciences perspective, CO2-induced forcing, this is from a paper just a couple of months ago, it's discovered that CO2-induced forcing as readily destabilizes the climate of water-rich rock-like planets as does stars that are going nova or supernova. So we don't have to have the energy of the sun increase. Indeed, we can just mess with the atmospheric chemistry of the planet and it produces the same result. Climate instability, which is caused by cloud feedback, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, leads to a new steady state that's about 57 degrees Celsius. That's a problem. We're currently at about 15 degrees Celsius, and in the last 2 billion years of the planet's history, we've never been above 23 degrees Celsius. So 57 is a big deal. Basically, the planet has experienced two relatively stable states over the course of the last 2 billion years. Ice Age, 12 degrees Celsius, global average, and 22 degrees Celsius above average hothouse, or Jurassic Park, or dinosaur days, or whatever you want to call it. Evidence that abrupt climate change is underway is provided by NASA recently, whereas it took the first 265 years of the Industrial Revolution. The first 265 years, from 1750 to September of 2015, during that 265 years, the global average temperature rose 1 degree Celsius. And in the next 4 months, it increased an additional 0.57 degrees Celsius. This is what the exponential function looks like. We're not familiar with the exponential function because it doesn't really influence our lives. Imagine, I'd love to see this experiment done in grocery stores around the world, effective, say, June 1st. June 1st, everything's going to be normal. People go to the store, the bread is in the bread aisle, everything, the bread aisle is like half an aisle or a third of an aisle in the grocery store. What I'd like to see is on June 2nd, all the grocery stores in the country double the size of the bread aisle. And then do it again the next day and double it again the next day. Well, after about 5 days, you go into the store looking for a can of peaches or maybe a fresh apple, and there's a bread store. Every grocery store is a bread store. Within a few days, that's what exponential change looks like. We're not familiar with that because when we go to the bread aisle, there's bread there. And right next to it, there's other things. It's not just a bread store, right? There's all kinds of interesting things there. What we experience in our daily lives is the near future looks a lot like the recent past. And that's been the case for our entire lives, for our entire history as a species. The next few days always look like the last few days. Until now. More evidence that abrupt climate change is underway and has cracked the mainstream media, including in The Guardian less than a month ago, Climate Central, and you can see the evidence right here. 2010 was the hottest year on record until 2014 came along, and then until 2015 came along, 2014 was the hottest year on record, and 2016 we're blowing everything away. In addition, there's a 10-year lag between emissions of carbon dioxide and maximum heating associated with carbon dioxide, thus guaranteeing that the next 10 years will be hotter than any previous 10 years in history. So we're at the early stages of abrupt climate change, and it's an event that has precedence in Earth's history, not in our history, but in Earth's history. Typically, you can see there's been pretty rapid changes from one state to another, and those stages are as rapidly as a 5 degree Celsius global average temperature rise in a span of 13 years, according to a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is fast. This is what we're talking about. This is during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. I congratulate myself every time I say that successfully, and I never say it again for the rest of the talk. It's the PETM from now on. Climate changes during the PETM occurred over much longer time periods than what we're experiencing now as a result of anthropogenic climate change. And that's the case before we hit abrupt climate change. Even before we hit the abrupt phase, when we were still in the Al Gore linear style climate change that we all heard about and learned about in school, even at that point, the climatic changes during the PETM occurred over much longer temporal spans than what we're observing today. So the effects of the latter may thus even be more severe. In finalist for the understatement of the year, may be less severe. This is science speak for you. Everything's just a little bit more conservative than reality. Anthropogenic carbon release is unprecedented during the last 66 million years. It's actually occurring about 10 times faster. Carbon dioxide release into the atmosphere is occurring about 10 times faster than it did during the PETM. During any time during the PETM, when the global average temperature rose at 1.5 degrees Celsius in 13 years. So if this sounds problematic to you, it's because you've been paying attention. Climate change and abrupt climate change are two outcomes or consequences or symptoms of civilization. Civilization is a heat engine. It's an indication of our overshoot. Civilization is the handgun of the city pointed at the face of nature. Civilization means cities. Once you commit to cities, you've committed to human population overshoot because the area in the city is not sufficiently able to grow the food, provide the water, provide the air for the people who are living there. You're an overshoot when you live in a city. So, and they have the same root words, civilization and city, has civitas as the root word. So civilization is the handgun here. And we are committed, addicted. It's the only thing we've ever known. The last several thousand years on the planet have been characterized by various civilizations. We were all born into captivity. We were born into the captivity of civilization that started up some 265 years ago. We didn't get to choose. We didn't get to vote. We just showed up at this time in history, which is pretty incredible because it's the most amazing, awesome time in history. We have these digital devices that allow us to find out more things than we ever could before at the snap of a finger. And also, we get to be here at the end of the show. Only collapse of civilization prevents runaway climate change, according to work done by Tim Garrett at the University of Utah, climate scientist who has published 3 papers that I know of at this point, pointing out that civilization is a heat engine. The only way to stop overheating the planet is to turn off civilization, and I don't think very many people are going to vote for that. So what Garrett is publishing indicates that it doesn't really matter how we power the civilization. Solar panels, wind turbines, wave power, whatever. All those things might make us feel good, but they still sustain civilization, which is a heat engine. And this is me, by the way, not very long ago. Okay, my hair was a lot grayer than that, not very long ago. And I wasn't in that good a shape. There's a whole bunch of things wrong with the picture that really doesn't look like me. But it wasn't very long ago that I thought this would work. And so I live off-grid in a 2.7 acre property with 3.15 kilowatts of solar panels on the roof, and I thought that this was the answer. So I left the active service at the university, and I put all my money into developing this homestead because it seemed like the right thing to do. And I'm just powering civilization by other means, as it turns out. But I made those mistakes a long time ago. I'd like to think I'm smarter now. Actually, I'd like to think that I make my mistakes repeatedly, and that's how I learn so well from them. And perhaps others can as well. The response of civilization, and one of the other consequences of civilization, has always been the same: monetary transfer. That's one of the indicators of civilization. And an excellent indicator of a civilization that is about to fail is when the disparity in wealth becomes particularly excessive. Most of you are probably aware that a couple of years ago, the 85 wealthiest people on the planet had the same amount of resources, the same amount of money as the poorest half of the people on the planet. That was so 2 years ago. Within the last year, it's 42 people who have the same amount of wealth as half the people on the planet. So the disparity continues to grow, and the response to that disparity remains pretty much the same. Civilization has other consequences too, besides wealth disparity, besides transferring money from the poor to the wealthy, which is an indication of civilization, in particular of civilizations that are near their end. There are things like coral bleaching and extinction at the rate of 150 to 200 species a day, according to an estimate from the United Nations in August of 2010. So there are other consequences beyond civilization as a heat engine, beyond the monetary transfer. There's the foul of the air and the dirtying of the water and the wholesale erosion of the soil into the ocean. And all those things are products of civilization, of human population overshoot, of movement of materials from the country to the city, and all that goes along with that. Again, this is the last 2 billion years, or 1,000 million. In other parts of the world, a billion means a completely different thing. So it's very confusing when I post something on Facebook and I refer to something as a billion, which is in the United States 1,000 million, but in other places as a million. And so it generates all kinds of confusion for Kiwis. Right? So if you go to New Zealand and you ask for $1 billion, you need to know what you're asking for. We have had humans, something resembling humans on the planet within about this period of time. 5 or 6 million years, a very short period of time. Our species showed up in a slice so thin here that you can't see it, Homo sapiens. And during that entire time, humans have been maintained, have existed in a relatively narrow range of temperature. The coarse distribution, the coarse resolution of this graph doesn't fully indicate, for example, the 5C global average temperature rise 55 million years ago doesn't show up here. The coarse resolution doesn't tell you that we've managed to survive ice ages, and somewhere between 2.2 and 3.2 C above baseline, which takes us at the highest level about right here. So we've managed to persist between 12 and 17 degrees Celsius on the planet. Some people think we will be able to persist long, up to here and up to here and up to here, and some people even falsely, I believe that we can persist all the way up to Jurassic Park in a short period of time. I think what those folks are missing is that we are human animals. And as such, we depend upon habitat, as do other organisms, to survive. And in our case, that habitat must include a whole bunch of other species that we depend upon for our existence, notably manifesting themselves as food. Right, so without plants, without plankton in the ocean, which teeter on the brink, without land plants on the land, we're going to have a hard time getting along because that defines our habitat. Currently, we're at about 15 degrees Celsius. Baseline was about 13.5 degrees Celsius, just about 1.5 degrees above ice age, and we've passed numerous tipping points along the way. According to a paper by Oliver Tickell in The Guardian in August 2008, 4C all we can plan for is extinction. And then he goes on to say that we'll probably be able to survive 4C, 5C, maybe even 6C above baseline. I can't even imagine how we get there, given that we've only had humans at 3.3 maximum above baseline on the planet. The 2C target, which has always been a political target, not a scientific target, the 2C target seems particularly absurd when you realize that it could be we've only had humans on the planet at 2.2 above baseline. But at 2 we'll be fine. That's when we need to worry, is at 2. Right? The scientific target is established by the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases in October 1990, nearly 26 years ago, was 1 degree C. That was the absolute upper limit which we could not cross. David Spratt, climate writer, climate speaker, said about 2 years ago that probably 0.5 degree was the target. That's the Rubicon we could not cross. Well, we crossed that one a long time ago. Well, it could be that that's not true. We haven't actually completed this trial yet. This is us, the unbelievably immature youngster in the chemistry lab, blowing the shit out of things and wondering why we haven't killed ourselves yet. So it could be that we'll survive 4C or 5C or 6C, or maybe we'll go all the way to Jurassic Park by the September after next. We don't know, do we? Because we're not done yet. So it could be that we can continue to devastate the planet without negative consequences for us, our favorite species. But probably not. It was June 29th, 1989, that United Nations Environment Program Director says we have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. Well, that was a long time ago. Just shy of 27 years, if I'm doing the math right, which means we have just shy of 17 years that we've been beyond the point at which humans are able to fix it. And that's evident in the myriad self-reinforcing feedback loops we have subsequently triggered since that time. I want to show a little video clip that appeared on an HBO program called The Newsroom, written by, anybody? Sorkin. Thank you, Aaron Sorkin. Oh, it's a good thing there's people in the audience who actually pay attention to what I've said before. I'm like the singer who forgets the words to the song that he wrote. I heard about this. Jackson Browne at a concert, he was playing a song, and he forgot the words, so he had to turn to the audience. How does that go again? It's the same thing. So Aaron Sorkin wrote this episode. It appeared in October, November 2014, the second season of the show.
So there weren't many hard questions. I'm just going to ask you to expand on the report. Pretend you're an expert witness and I'm your lawyer. Sounds good.
Intense.
Stand by camera 1. Administrator of the EPA.
Welcome, thank you.
Mr. Westbrook, you've spent most of your professional career as a climate scientist in the public sector.
Yes, 10 years as a supervisory management analyst in the Office of Environmental Information. And before that, I was a program specialist in the EPA's Resource Management Division.
And you have a PhD in climate science from Stanford.
Yes, and another in chemistry with a master's in biology.
Okay. Tell us about the findings in the report that was just released.
The latest measurements taken at Mauna Loa in Hawaii indicate a CO2 level of 400 parts per million.
Just so we know what we're talking about, if you were a doctor and we were the patient, what's your prognosis? 1,000 years, 2,000 years?
A person has already been born who will die due to catastrophic failure of the planet.
What did he just say?
Okay, can you expand on that?
Sure. The last time there was this much CO2 in the air, the oceans were 80 feet higher than they are now. Two things you should know. Half the world's population lives within 120 miles of an ocean.
And the other?
Humans can't breathe underwater.
You're saying the situation's dire.
Not exactly. Your house is burning to the ground. The situation's dire. Your house has already burned to the ground. Situation's over.
So what can we do to reverse this?
Well, there's a lot we could do. Good for 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, but now, no.
Can you make an analogy that might help us understand?
Sure. It's as if you're sitting in your car, in your garage, with the engine running and the door closed, and you've slipped into unconsciousness, and that's it.
What if someone comes and opens the door?
You're already dead.
What if the person got there in time?
Then you'd be safe.
Okay, so now what's the CO2 equivalent of the getting there on time?
Shutting off the car 20 years ago.
You sound like you're saying it's hopeless.
Yeah.
Is that the administration's position or yours?
There isn't a position on this any more than there's a position on the temperature at which water boils.
The administration, let me try to, your administration.
And don't forget I need you to
Supports wind,
stretch.
solar, clean coal, nuclear power, raising fuel economy standards, and building a more efficient electrical grid.
Yes.
And?
That would have been great.
Let's see if we can't find a better spin. People are starting their weekends. The report says we can release 565 more gigatons of CO2 without the effects being
It
calamitous.
says we can only release 565 gigatons.
So what if we only release 564?
Well, then we would have a reasonable shot at some form of dystopian post-apocalyptic life. But the carbon dioxide in the oil that we've already released is 2,795 gigatons. So,
What would all this look like?
well, mass migrations, food and water shortages, spread of deadly disease, endless wildfires, way too many to keep under control. Storms that have the power to level cities, blacken out the sky, and create permanent darkness.
Are you going to get in trouble for saying this publicly?
Who cares?
Mr. Westbrook, we want to inform people, but we don't want to alarm them. Can you give us a reason to be optimistic?
Well, that's the thing. Well, Americans are optimistic by nature. And if we face this problem head on, if we listen to our best scientists and act decisively and passionately, I still don't see any way we can survive.
Okay, Richard Westbrook, Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'd appreciate if you wait and clap for me. You know, it's just TV.
You shared it.
I can't tell you how many people, after this came out, sent me an email message and said, "Is that you? Is that guy modeled after you?" I didn't watch it. I don't watch TV. I've never seen the episode. I've just seen that 4 minutes. Interestingly, you'll note that the guy had a master's degree in biology. That's pivotal here. You won't find very many other climate scientists, probably none, who will say the things that I say. Because almost no climate scientists are conservation biologists. They don't spend their lives studying speciation and extinction. James Hansen, the most renowned climate scientist in the world, has degrees in physics and astronomy. Physicists, engineers, astronomers, they're the fix-it-up kind of people. Right? The American exceptionalism, we can fix anything sort of approach. Well, not if you rely on habitat, you can't. And we rely upon habitat. We're animals. We're human animals, and we need habitat to survive. I want to walk through some of the things the character said. He mentioned 80-foot sea level rise, which is 20-meter sea level rise, as being already locked in. But he failed to mention that at actually 385 parts per million, he was pointing out we were at 400, we're now at 409 parts per million. At 385 parts per million, there's 23-meter sea level rise locked in, and also a 6C global average temperature rise locked in. The heating associated with carbon dioxide currently in the atmosphere will persist for at least 1,000 years, according to a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, February 2012. We've known this for a long time. The official also talked about mass migrations. What he meant was a refugee crisis. Migration, as any biologist knows, is a two-way street. We have migratory birds. That means they move south in the winter and move north in the summer. They migrate. They're not refugees. What we're seeing right now is a refugee crisis, the likes of which the world has never seen. Why are people leaving the Middle East and Northern Africa? Why are people leaving Pacific Island states? Because there's no habitat for humans there anymore. It's simple when you view it from a biological perspective. It's absolutely simple. Climate exodus is expected, really expected, in the Middle East and Northern Africa. I was in Europe about a year ago on a speaking tour, and everywhere I went in Western Europe, people were complaining, Donald Trump style, about the Middle Easterners and Northern Africans fleeing into their countries. And they wanted to keep them out. It's underway. The mainstream media is catching on, finally, this week and last week, when U.S. Secretary of the Interior Jewel, I forgot her first name, just like that. Sally? Is that right? Thank you. See? You get to be this old and the shit just falls out of your head and it doesn't come back in there anymore. So Sally Jewell said, we will have climate refugees. Well, of course she said that because we already do. And finally, the government is admitting as much, just like the mainstream media is admitting as much, that these things are already underway. The character talked about food and water shortages. Again, they're underway. Syria, people are not leaving Syria because they're looking for a vacation. People are leaving Syria because the food they've relied upon for thousands of years of human society in Syria is gone. And it ain't coming back. Water shortages, we're running out of water. And the world's powers, whoever that is, I thought it was us, but maybe that's just me, are very worried. And with good reason, because water is nice. Isn't it great? I mean, the drought is allegedly over in California, so it's nothing to worry about now. You take a shower all damn day, right? The drought's over, so I heard. The spread of deadly disease has been underway for a while with things like Lyme and malaria and dengue and now Zika. And finally, it might actually make people notice in the United States because we have the first American that dies of complications due to Zika. Oh, none of that mattered when it was brown people, now did it? But now it's Americans who are actually dying from the spread of deadly diseases as a result of climate change. I was teaching this very topic in my classes 15, 20 years ago as something that would be on the way. The mainstream media are still telling you that it's on the way. It's not on the way. It's here. Again, endless wildfires, way too many to control. How about this headline from today in which Fort McMurray, ironically, right in the heart of the tar sands in Edmonton, has been evacuated. At noon when I checked today, it was just over half of the 61,000 people in the city who had been evacuated. Since then, it's many, many more. We can't get an exact count, but it's somewhere between half and all of the people in Fort McMurray are leaving because of Arctic wildfires in early May. Last year, the United States experienced more acres burned than ever in history. And you saw what the graph looks like for temperature in 2016 as opposed to 2015. Storms that have the power to level cities and create permanent darkness, well, it hasn't been permanent yet, but Katrina more than 10 years ago was kind of a big deal. And then Sandy, not much later, And then in rapid succession, one each year, Haiyan, Winston, and Patricia, are these enormous record-setting storms. The biggest one ever in the fill-in-the-blank, right, the Pacific Ocean. Now that La Nina is back, we could, or appears to be back, we could have similar storms occurring in the Atlantic where they've been largely absent for the last couple of years. So civilization is a heat engine. It has all these consequences. Abrupt climate change is one of them. It's clearly underway. Collapse of civilization has consequences too. Turning off the heat engine will have, interestingly enough, the effect of raising global average temperature between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius in a matter of days. Global dimming. There's a BBC documentary on the topic from 2005, I believe it is, so more than 10 years ago. In addition to greenhouse gases produced by industrial activity, there are also other particulates produced by industrial activity, most notably aerosols and sulfates from low-quality coal or high-sulfur coal. So in addition to putting greenhouse gases that trap heat, like putting blankets on the bed when it's already a hot summer day, industrial activity produces particulates that reflect incoming sunlight. So we're only getting a fraction of the sunlight we would otherwise get were we not burning coal and oil. So we're producing an umbrella at the same time we're throwing the blankets on the bed. And as we learned on September 14th, 2001, 3 days after 9/11, just stopping the flying of United States planes produced a profound impact on global average temperature. We didn't stop burning coal. Nobody else stopped flying. But global average high temperatures increased by about 0.5 degree Celsius and low temperatures decreased by about 0.5 degree Celsius. And that leads to conclusions like this, depending on the date of the paper. The most recent paper indicates that there will be up to a 3 degree global average temperature rise within a few days after civilization's failure. So we can't just turn off the heat engine at this point, right? There's no way out. In addition, turning off the heat engine, if we could do it, tomorrow, would produce the kinds of fires this planet has never witnessed in the form of 1,200 spent fuel ponds filled with spent fuel rods at nuclear power stations being exposed to the air because the water will evaporate if cool water is not constantly added. So those fuel rods will evaporate off all the water and then will explode and create the kinds of fires this planet has never witnessed, and there are 1,200 of them. So think Fukushima times a whole bunch, and more catastrophic impacts than Fukushima because this didn't happen at Fukushima. The spent fuel rods were not exposed to the air. They did not explode. So that's going to be inconvenient even if you are optimistic by nature. Already, civilization in the form of growing grains teeters on the brink. Darj Mail does an excellent write-up every week. He's going to once a month soon, and it will be his climate dispatch, writing at Truth Out. And just about a month ago, he pointed out in the title, in the headline, that agriculture is on the brink. Because at only 1.5 degree global average temperature rise, that threatens the ability to grow grains. Why is that? Because almost all the grains are grown in the interior of large continents, primarily in the northern hemisphere. The interior of large continents warms up at least twice as fast as the global average because they're not influenced by marine systems, by that nice modulated air mass that is the ocean. So already civilization teeters on the brink at 1.5 degrees Celsius above baseline and getting hotter. Even the slow rise, notice when this paper was published, that means it was written in 2012 or earlier. It takes about 18 months to get a refereed journal article published. So this paper was published and based on research 2012 or earlier. What that means is there was about a 0.85 global average temperature rise above baseline at the time the paper was written. Even at that point, the rise in global average temperature was stripping the ability of organisms to keep up by a factor of 10,000 times. And the organisms under study in this particular case, vertebrates. Oh, that's us. So we can't keep up. There's no way to adapt. We can't move fast enough. Even if If we didn't need all those other organisms we depend upon for food and other free services they provide, like cleaning our water and cleaning our air, converting our carbon dioxide into oxygen and so on, we still can't keep up. I haven't talked about the 10-year lag between carbon dioxide emissions and maximum heating associated with those carbon dioxide emissions. So again, we haven't seen the worst of it in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. And finally, from just yesterday, climate tipping point could be here. Yeah, really, you think could? I've identified 65 self-reinforcing feedback loops with respect to climate change, including the Clath rate gun and moistening of the upper troposphere, that are very fast feedbacks, either one of which alone has great potential to cause our extinction in the very near term. Signs indicate we've reached the threshold scientists fear. Yeah, that's a done deal. And the critical lines here are abrupt and irreversible. We're in the midst of abrupt climate change, and it is irreversible at temporal spans that matter to humans. At some point, the planet might cool down, as it has over the course of the last 2 billion years periodically. But we won't be around to see it. The hits keep coming at a rate so fast I can hardly keep up. But the oceans are becoming anoxic and could be completely depleted in oxygen at levels that matter to the organisms that live there as early as 2030. As early as 2030. Not only is water great, but food's incredible. And air, it's one of my favorite things. If it weren't for weed, air would be my favorite thing. Oh, wait. To breathe. Sometimes my out loud voice gets me in trouble. I want to talk briefly about 2 self-reinforcing feedback loops, either of which has the potential to cause human extinction in the very near term. The first of those is exponential rise of atmospheric methane, widely reported in the referee journal literature. Paper by Michael Jennings in Global Policy several years ago now. A suite, not one, but several amplifying feedback mechanisms or self-reinforcing feedback loops have been triggered. They're underway. And even the conservative scientific community admits as much. In July of 2013, NASA reported through direct observations using satellites that the methane plumes bubbling out of the Arctic Ocean were as much as 150 kilometers across. Imagine you're in a sailing ship, and as far as you can see in every direction, the ocean is bubbling. It looks like ginger ale. That's what a plume 150 kilometers across looks like. These are direct observations. These aren't models. That exponential rise of atmospheric methane coinciding with the atmospheric rise of other greenhouse gases since 1750 leads Paul Beckwith's climate scientist at the University of Ottawa to conclude that we're headed for a global average temperature rise of at least 5 degrees Celsius within a decade or two, based on that one self-reinforcing feedback loop. And he says, the International Energy Agency says business as usual, maintaining civilization in its current form leads to up to a 6 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2050. So in late November 2014, when he made this prediction, he said, I'm just adding this one self-reinforcing feedback loop. It's not that big a deal to 5 or 6 above baseline in a decade or two. Ignoring methane by 2050. So he says, I'm just adding this one thing. Well, that's a one person's observation and prediction, and it has not been vetted through the referee journal literature. It's not a conservative source, so I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to talk with respect to the science from here on out just about one self-reinforcing feedback loop that I haven't mentioned much in previous talks or my previous writing, and that's moistening of the upper troposphere. Water vapor is actually the most abundant greenhouse gas. It's 97% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is water vapor. And water vapor serves to trap long-wave radiation, so it can't escape. It's the blankets we keep putting on. And we don't think much about water vapor because it's just out there. It's just humid or it's not. And it is in here. We know about carbon dioxide, and that's what's made all the news, so we've tended to ignore water vapor, but even the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper in there indicates that this is the largest known feedback mechanism, is moistening the upper troposphere. And a paper in Skeptical Science, another very conservative course, concludes that a 1 degree temperature rise as a result of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, really when we add on these other self-reinforcing feedback loops, is as much as 3 C. And bear in mind we're over 1.5 C at this point. So when we include these other feedbacks, which they don't mention, but which certainly include methane and a few of the others that I haven't mentioned, then we're headed for 3 C as a result. Well, we're at 1.5 C as a result of carbon dioxide. That suggests to me that if we add together moistening of the upper troposphere plus collapse of civilization, which will result either from temperature rise or from the financial collapse that is underway and will undoubtedly be complete soon. You know, it doesn't really matter whether we look at this from the financial perspective or not. The ability to grow grains is already threatened, and a temperature rise because of moistening the upper troposphere or methane release is going to cause the temperature rise to be so great that we won't be able to grow grains. And grains are the basis for civilization. Without grains, we don't sustain this set of living arrangements. So just collapse of civilization plus moistening the upper troposphere and those other innocuous other feedbacks that are mentioned leads to 6 to 8 degrees C above where we are now. Well, the midpoint of that is right there, Jurassic Park. The high end of that is right there, where we were at 252 million years ago, when during the Gray Dying, we had a global average temperature rise of just over 10 degrees Celsius that occurred over a span of somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 years. This time, it's occurring in a matter of years. In fact, equilibrium between global average temperature and moistening of the upper troposphere is complete in a matter of weeks. Not months, not years, certainly not decades, certainly not 20 to 80,000 years, weeks. So that's how rapidly this particular self-reinforcing feedback loop operates. So we can pretty much ignore methane. We can admit that methane is one of those other feedbacks that is mentioned in the Skeptical Science paper. And there are 60-some others to go along with it. We can just include moistening of the upper troposphere and collapse of civilization, which results from those high temperatures and make us incapable of growing grains at scale. And boom, we're at Jurassic Park in a very short period of time. I used to put dates on this stuff. I used to say, so what that means is by such and such a year, all humans will be gone. But I don't do that anymore, because if, for example, I made the prediction that by 2030 humans will be extinct, everybody in the audience would go, okay, I have until December 31st, 2029. Everything's going to be fine. And then at midnight, I'm going to die in my sleep. That's not what I mean. So there's too much focus on the day and not enough on the rest of the message, which is that we might want to live with some urgency. We might want to live with death in mind. Our lives are short. Finally, I want to mention again how rapidly events could transpire. We currently are experiencing ice melt in the Arctic that's 2 weeks ahead of any previous year. 2012 was the minimum ice cover in the Arctic in human history. We haven't had an ice-free Arctic in the entire run of our genus, the genus Homo, on the planet, 2.8 million years since we had an ice-free Arctic. And it looks like we're headed for an ice-free Arctic. The U.S. Naval Postgraduate School predicts that we will have an ice-free Arctic in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. So I'd say we dodged a bullet for the last 3 years, but it's coming. The headline, and I think it was the Christian Science Monitor where I first ran across this prediction, the headline says, in 2016, 84 years ahead of schedule. Because, you know, everything happens in 2100. Right? Every other climate scientist talks about how dire things are going to be in 2100, like on January 1st. Well, that's absurd. Nature doesn't have a schedule. And even if nature has a schedule, she didn't check with us. So 84 years ahead of schedule, there's going to be an ice-free Arctic. people. In any event, these are the data up to very recently with respect to aerial extent. Even the very conservative U.S. Geological Survey says we could have an ice-free Arctic this year. And now the data look like this. Because the sensor on the satellite that measures ice cover in the Arctic has gone offline. So we only have data through March 31st of this year. If you were a conspiracy theorist, oh, never mind. So it could be that we're headed for an ice-free Arctic. If so, I don't see any way to avoid that 50 gigaton burst of methane that field researcher Natalia Shkova says is highly possible at any time. I don't see how we can avoid that. That's a big burst of methane that once it circulates around the globe, which would take about a year, we'd observe about a 1.3 C global average temperature rise. Plus the 1.6 we're at right now, that takes us to 2.9. We might have had humans on the planet in as little as 2.2. That's going to be inconvenient. It's going to happen in a very short period of time, about a year and a half from now, if we have an ice-free Arctic and if there is this 50 gigaton burst of methane that results from that ice-free Arctic. So that means somewhere between 4 and 6 above today, which is way far above baseline, then people have seriously considered human extinction occurring in a very, very short period of time. Way too rapidly for humans or any other organism to keep up. So it could be, if we have an ice-free Arctic, and if as a consequence we have that eruption of methane, that first 50 gigaton burst of methane, it won't be the last, then it could be we experience a warm planet beyond which humans are able to persist in a very, very short period of time. Now, I'm not suggesting that every human will be dead a year and a half from now, even if we have an ice-free Arctic. Right? There's a bunch of people like me who left active service at the university and went out and built this homestead and managed to grow all this food and store a bunch away and have a bunch of water harvesting and all that sort of stuff. So I'll be fine for another week or two. And that'll be awesome. It'll be like, there'll be some So again, from the planetary sciences community, astrobiology, taking the long view and headed for that hothouse Earth, the 57C we mentioned previously. Extinction is the cosmic default for most life. I love that. For most life that is ever emerged on the surfaces of most life? Really? I thought all species went extinct. Maybe I missed something in my conservation biology class that I taught, or that I took. All species go extinct. All individuals die. The cosmic default? What is that? Is that aliens coming to save us or something? I don't get some of this stuff at all. Ugh. All species go extinct. And it looks like, in our case, we missed the ark. It sounds like you're saying the situation is hopeless. Yeah. I'm hope-free. For me, hope is a 4-letter word, like fear. I try not to live there. Hope and fear are the projections onto the future over which we have no control. So I try not to do that. So I try to remain, quoting grief walker Stephen Jenkinson, I try to remain hope-free, not hopeless. And that doesn't mean that I am proposing in any form inaction. I'm not. I'm not suggesting, as some of my critics have concluded, that we just all lay down and die. For one thing, it could be a long wait. Right. So Edward Abbey, a major influence in my young life, when he was dying in the desert in Tucson, Arizona, in March of 1989, he went out into his sleeping bag and lay out in his backyard. And his friend, and now my friend Doug Peacock, was with him. And he went out there to die, and he lay down, and he couldn't die. This stuff takes longer sometimes than we think it could possibly take. And he had this unbelievable conversation with Doug Peacock, and we talked about that conversation with Peacock on my radio show, about how much more difficult this is than he imagined. Interestingly, Abbey had been diagnosed with a terminal condition. His doctor 7 years earlier had given him a few weeks to live. And so Abbey says, in his typically hard-shelled response, the kind of thing I might say, he said, "I guess I don't have to floss my teeth anymore." And so people tell me that I'm telling people that it's hopeless, which it is, and that I'm telling people to lay down and die, which I'm not, and that I might as well stop flossing my teeth. Well, you should have seen Abbey's teeth. 7 years later, he didn't have teeth to be really proud of. So I keep flossing my teeth. I think that I don't have long on this planet, and it really wouldn't much matter whether I floss my teeth, and I really don't like it anyway. But I keep flossing my teeth. I would encourage you to do the same. Abbey is noted for a couple of his expressions about hope. One is, action is the antidote to despair, and another one of my favorites is, sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. He didn't give up either. Even in his dying time, he didn't give up on taking action against imperialism, against the machine that is industrial civilization. So the question arises frequently, especially when I present on college campuses. College students come up to me afterwards and thinking I'm wise. You know, Homo sapiens means the wise ape. Let's think about that for a minute and get a good chuckle, shall we? So for a few years I've been thinking we should call ourselves Homo calidus, the clever ape, as in too clever by half. And then recently somebody suggested a better name, I think, Homo incendiaris, like we're burning the planet. So what do we do? Now what? What should we do? Students come up to me all the time, what should I do? I don't know. I don't know your expiration date. I don't think you should stop flossing your teeth, and I don't know what you should do. So my response to almost anybody who asks is, what do you love? And that's like if you're at a party, almost always the conversation starter at the party is, what do you do? Right? And by what do you do, people mean, how do you destroy the planet? Are you really good at it? Do you make a lot of money? Are you important? What do you do? How much money do you make? And so my response is always something like I'm a homesteader, I milk goats, and then they're backing up. And I write books, and I go around reminding people that they're going to die just like everybody else. And then I ask them the question, the one that sends them fleeing from the room as if their hair is on fire. What do you do? What do you love? You want to freak somebody out? Try that one. So people ask me what they should do. I ask them, what do they love? That's what you should do. That's what you're going to be passionate about. Passionately pursue a life of excellence. You know, Socrates spent his entire 70 years trying to figure out what that meant. Going around and asking everybody he could bump into, which admittedly wasn't a hell of a lot of people at the time, what is excellence? And he would ask it in the form of 6 different questions. You know, he only went around asking 6 questions in various forms, all of which led him to the pursuit of excellence. What is courage? What is good? What is moderation? What is justice? What is piety? What is virtue? Those are the 6 questions that he asked everybody he bumped into in pursuit of a life of excellence. Do what you love. Passionately pursue a life of excellence. And I don't know what that means for you, beyond, you know, flossing your teeth. Another thing I suggest that people do is to act like your dog. So this is us, right? This is me. This is me every day. Waking up and thinking about all those things I need to worry about, and all those things that I needed to take care of that I didn't, that I'm still worried about. And you go to the park with the dog, and what does the dog see? Reality. The dog sees right now. What do we see? Everything but reality. Let's try some of this. Let's try to be human beings instead of humans doing. This is what we're good at. We're good at doing things. Let's try being for a while. Just be. Somebody, must be a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, says, after I talked for an hour, right, and thought I was saying these important things that are going to change lives. I'm over that now. Such hubris. But a while, it wasn't that long ago, I thought that's what I was doing, right? So this woman asked, if you had to break this down into 3 sentences, because I wasn't really paying attention, what would it be? 3 sentences. And I go, oh, geez, that's tough. I've been talking for an hour. How about 3 words? Be here now. That's what I would suggest. Take a lead from your dog. If you want more, and how would you not? I mean, really. If you want more about the science, there's a single essay at my blog, Nature Bats Last, that will reveal all the evidence I've indicated today and a whole lot more about methane and links to all the papers I talked about, so you can find out that I wasn't just making up this whole thing. Today. I made it up yesterday, replicated it. Not really. There are other things to do as well. With a colleague, I've created a workshop for people who have come to the conclusion that we are, in fact, in our dying time, that we are the last humans to occupy the planet, that we are in the midst of near-term human extinction, and that will include not only all my friends and family, but me too. And so this workshop is for that very lonely experience when you're the person who got there and you can't find anybody else to talk to, which was my life for a really long time, like from 2002 until the day before yesterday. And I've written a book with the same colleague. It's for ages 11 and up, especially the parents of those ages 11 and up, because like many books and films allegedly targeted at children, it's really targeted at the adults. It's a work of fiction, sort of. It's like Edward Abbey's, the last book he saw published, the subtitle for which was An Honest Novel. And it describes an aged and dying man who's going back home to Home, Pennsylvania, where, coincidentally, Edward Abbey grew up. So this book is about civilization and its consequences from the perspective of small things, a ladybug and a honeybee specifically, and the characters they run into along the way. And finally, my next to the last book is called Extinction Dialogues, again co-authored by somebody else, Carolyn Baker. And the subtitle tells the whole story, How to Live with Death in Mind. And that really is the whole story that I'm trying to get across today. That at some point you're going to die. And I like the story Peter told just a couple of days ago. He says, lately we've been running into a lot of people who ask the question, what drugs are you going to take? No, really. People have become so adept at talking about death after they hear about this for a while. It's one of those taboo subjects, right? We never talk about death or dying or grief or grieving or bodily functions in this culture. We just ignore it. That's all taboo, right? You don't talk about picking your nose, and you certainly don't do it, right? These are sort of normal bodily functions that we just never talk about. Goats don't have this problem. But lately, people are rushing up after a talk, and they want to know how I'm going to die. And I think when, but I don't know my expiration date either. And it's really interesting. So people are constantly asking, what kind of drugs are you going to take? And so Peter came up with this clever little expression. He says, well, I don't want to mediate my vision of reality the last hour or hours or minutes or whatever. I don't want this to turn into just a fog where I'm no longer really fully conscious. I don't want to spend my last minutes like that. Now that I think about it, I don't want to spend my last few hours like that. Oh, now that I think about it, I don't want to spend my last few days or my last few weeks or the rest of my life like that either. And I think that's right, at least for me. I want to live fully present. I don't want to, you know, they say reality is for people who can't handle pharmaceuticals. I prefer reality, at least so far. So I don't know how I'm going to die. And I'm not recommending that you do it either. You know, before I became the relatively compassionate, not completely screwed up individual that I am today, by which I mean, you know, last week,
I used to present on college campuses, and I'd do such clever things as tell people that when you're committing suicide by slitting your wrists, you go this way instead of that way. And it wasn't well received on college campuses. It's weird, I know, right? These are the people who claim they're having the conversations. So I almost never get invited back to places like that. In any event, so I don't talk about those things anymore. Now I talk about how to live. But you were never promised another day. You were never promised another moment. And like that quote from Homer at the beginning from the Iliad, you don't know, you never know which breath is going to be your last. The world is more beautiful when you realize that. You actually can stop and smell the roses when you realize that I might not be here next year when the roses are out. So let's be here now. Let's live. Let's figure out how to live with death in mind, because death is always there, rattling at the door. The odds against any one of us being here, we know a lot about DNA. We know, based on that knowledge of DNA, that the odds against any one of us being here exceed the odds against plucking a single atom at random from the entire universe. They exceed the odds against buying one single lottery ticket every week and winning every week for the rest of your life. That's how uncommon, how rare it is for this collection of DNA to be here. And yet, here we are. One time around. Let's make the most of that, shall we? Thank you very much.
Thank you.